Welcome back to another episode in the year of Final Fantasy during the month of
Diablos.
And we're finally rounding out this Final Fantasy Legends side series with Legend 3, and in this case they saved the best for last in my opinion. But first, let's go ahead and talk about our first job of the video real quick, and then we'll get right into Legend 3. Now, as many of you know, by and large, all the classes that I've talked about I've covered a little bit more in depth before, and now we're kind of getting into some new territory. Right now we're just going to get just a very brief overview of these particular jobs. So first, I want to talk about the Berserker just really quick, and you can probably guess what he's about. The Berserker basically has a pretty high attack and a speed stat, and the downside to him is that he's uncontrollable, and that's really about it. It's less useful in more nuanced situations, but if you're just trying to do a lot of damage really quick, get through these random battles, maybe level up some, then the Berserker is definitely your guy. Anyway, let's get right into Final Fantasy Legend 3. For those catching the series for the first time, the Final Fantasy Legend series is not officially part of the Final Fantasy series. It was properly from the SaGa series in Japan, which was renamed to boost off of the Final Fantasy heritage in the US. Initially, it released as SaGa III in Japan in December of 1991 on the Game Boy, and it was subtitled The Ruler of Time and Space. Later, it would be released in North America in 1993 under the name of Final Fantasy Legend 3. Similarly, as Legend 2 got a DS remake in Japan, so did Legend 3, aka SaGa III. So for Legend 3, several new people make their way into the development of this game, primarily the series newcomer Chihiro Fujioka, sorry if I mispronounced that, is heading up the development, and very interestingly enough, he's providing some of the music composition aside this game's main composer, Ryuji Sasai. And you'll note in this game, we're absent of Uematsu, so this is kind of one of the first times that we're seeing that Uematsu hasn't headed up the development compositions of a Final Fantasy game. In this case, it's a SaGa game. So seeing as this is the SaGa franchise, it follows similar traits as the others. We have the science fantasy themes here that we've seen in the other games, but this time, in fact, there is no tower in this game, but instead we're going to get a little bit more of a Chrono Trigger feeling, and it's probably why I gravitate towards this game rather than the other Legends games. Similar to Final Fantasy games, we start off with 4 characters, but unlike the other Legends games, we don't really get to pick our entire gamut of classes or races or whatever you want to call them. However, this doesn't mean that those aren't in here. It's just by the way that you come about them is a little bit different, though not completely, as you'll see some of the stuff has been retrofitted from other games, the SaGa games, and you'll see how that kind of forms into different races and classes. And through that, if you have played the other games, you'll know that there's a meat mechanic, which sounds kind of weird. I didn't really cover it in those. It's a fairly interesting concept and mechanic. As you eat it, you change into other monster characters into bigger, better monster characters. You're going to see this concept apply here in Final Fantasy Legend 3, but in a huge way, much more than what we've seen in the past 2 games. So how is this implemented? As you begin, you start off with a character that's either a human or a mutant. And remember, the mutants are called espers in Japan. Anyway, you get mutants and humans, and as you progress in your adventure, you'll find meat in these parts that are left behind whenever you kill enemies. You can incorporate these into your characters' bodies, and then you can transform into beasts and monsters or cyborgs and then robots. It all depends on the length that you're willing to transform yourself. It's actually a quite complex and intricate system, especially for a Game Boy RPG. And there's also an elemental characteristic as well that I'm not going to go into, but just be aware of that. So before we get into the story, I'm going to jump away from that, and we're going to take a bit of an aside and talk about our next job, which is going to be the Mystic Knight, or if you're going to properly translate it, it's actually Magic Fencer. The Mystic Knight, in some translations, maybe some fan translations, you'll see it pop up as the Sorcerer. It's pretty much what it sounds like, at least Mystic Knight-wise, not Sorcerer-wise, in the fact that it's a knight and they wield magic. However, you may be thinking that, oh, well, that kind of sounds like the Red Mage. And yeah, it kind of is, but the Mystic Knight is all about enhancing his attacks and weapons to do specific elemental damage or particular types of damage by attacking using his Spellblade ability, and you have to know that particular spell to use this ability, so you're gonna have to level up in another job first and then use those spells whenever you switch over to your Mystic Knight. I actually really enjoy this concept a lot. You'll see it pop back up in games like Final Fantasy Tactics as a Room Knight and other similar games like that. Anyway, So let's go ahead and talk about Final Fantasy Legend III's story. Probably my favorite aspect of the game, as it's very similar to Chrono Trigger, and Chrono Trigger had not come out at the time, so this was actually before that. Let me go ahead and read the opening intro story, and it goes like this.
The Pure Land water entity appeared and flooded this world's present, past, and future. The water brought monsters which hunted people day and night. Cities fell one by one, covered by the sea. However, a few individuals prepare for a journey that may determine the fate of this world. Behold, the city of Dharm. Here, 3 young people sent back as children from the ruins of the future are living with the Elder. He has reared them together with his own granddaughter.
So after this intro, you're clearly 4 young people going to go on an adventure, and I'll just briefly touch on the story of what you can expect whenever you play the game. Very early on, you're going to come into contact with a time-traveling ship similar to the one that you're going to find in Chrono Trigger. I mean, I guess a little bit similar, just in the fact that it's a time ship. And as you might expect, you're eventually going to use the ship to go and defeat the evil in the world to save it all and, the story. As you journey through these different time periods and throughout the world, you're going to come across guest characters, and the guest character concept was introduced in Legend 2 and even previously before in Final Fantasy II that released on the Super Nintendo, the characters that come in and then go away. Here though, the overall story and design, the concepts behind the game are just vastly different from the past 2 Legends games, and it's going to be attributed to the change in directors and the developing teams at the time, but in my opinion, this was for the better. I'm not saying that the other games were bad or anything like that, quite the contrary, I do like them, but I really, really enjoy this game. So one other thing that I've noticed is that this game kind of came out a little bit later in the Game Boy's lifetime, and from what I can see, it's an incredibly obscure game that a lot of people don't even know exists. Or if they do, they've just simply ignored it altogether. Either way, it would be something that I would definitely recommend that you check out. It's by far the most refined of the 3 in the series, and I must say it's one of my favorite Game Boy games altogether. So there's another little interesting, kind of funny tidbit of information that I came across while I was researching this. A man by the name of Ted Woosley was the translator, and he was given the Final Fantasy II script, the one that released on the Super Nintendo, and was told that there were to be, quote-unquote, no repeats of that mess, which I just think is hilarious. Apparently the Final Fantasy II script was just completely butchered in the translation, and they wanted to get as far away from that travesty as possible. Before we leave this Legend series, I suppose we should go over the DS release quickly, and again, this was a complete surprise to me. The remakes from Legend 2 that I talked about last time was a surprise, and Legend 3 probably even more of a surprise to me because Legend 3 itself is relatively unknown. The Legend 3 got its own remake, like I said, and it looks absolutely amazing. I definitely want to play this game. The remake of SaGa III was released on the DS, and it's now subtitled Shadow or Light, and it was released in Japan in 2011, relatively recently. The game has fantastically bright and well-designed graphics. It's got a kind of cel-shading look, and how the story translates, I can't say, but I'll definitely have to do some digging around and look and investigate an English patch and maybe play it somehow. That is it for the Legend series, for the SaGa series, and it's a fantastically underrated series. I do want to take the time to acknowledge the other games in the series, as this will be the only time probably that I'll ever do that, and much of this series is Japanese only, but many of them made their way over to the States in one form or another, and there do exist, like I said, fan translations. I do recommend going and checking out this series as it's overlooked, and it does have a lot to offer. I mean, if you like your science fantasy stuff, these are the games that you really want to be playing. If you want an access to a spiritual successor developed by much of the same staff as the SaGa series, I recommend checking out Legend of Legacy, which came out over here for the 3DS in 2015. If you want that SaGa series feel, that science fantasy, definitely check that out. So that's it for Final Fantasy Legend, our little side quest in the SaGa series. I hope you enjoyed these videos as much as I did making them. Next time on A Year of Final Fantasy in the month of Diablos, we're going to be looking at another vastly underrated game that released very recently, and that is Final Fantasy Explorers. So until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.